Welcome back for week 14 of the NHL Power Rankings, where 1 week at a time we watch everything that we thought we knew at the start of the season get turned on its head. And that is definitely evident once again in this week's Power Rankings, as things have gotten mixed around quite a bit for the second week in a row. And that all starts with our first honorable mention here, and the reason that I'm once again wearing a jersey in one of these videos. The Seattle Kraken are my first honorable mention, and again, this doesn't necessarily mean that if I was to rank all 32, they'd be the 12th ranked team. It's just a team that has earned their way to be around the top 10, and playing very well at this point in time. And with the Kraken, they've won 9 straight, and while that did start with a lot of 1-goal wins and some overtime games, now they've won their last 5 straight by 3 goals. And well, rightly so, a big part of the story in this Kraken turnaround has been the incredible play in net of Joey Daccord, with the team only giving up 9 goals in the first 8 of those 9 wins that they now have in a row. The streak of giving up 2 or fewer goals in 8 straight games was broken, giving up 4, surprisingly, to the Blue Jackets of all teams, but they still scored 7 the other way. And that's the part of the game that's now starting to pick up, as over the last 4 wins, they've scored 20 goals, averaging 5 per win, and scoring at least 4 in each of those games. So if Daccord keeps playing anywhere near the rate that he has been, and they start scoring at the rate they did last season and have over these last 4 games, this winning streak could just get longer and longer over the next few games. Although if they are going to continue the win streak, it's definitely not going to get easier here over the next few games, with a pretty decent Penguins team. Basically, when I release this video, they'll be facing them, and then have games against the Rangers and also red hot Oilers to finish up a 6-game road trip. Then with the second honorable mention is a team that might actually be in that 11 spot if I did go past 10. They're right around that area either way. It's the Philadelphia Flyers, who have been around the top 10 and even in it a couple of times here over the last few weeks, but they had a pretty decent week this week. They at least get 3 wins in 4 games, and sure, it starts out with a loss against the Penguins. And yeah, the first 2 wins weren't particularly convincing against teams that they really should have been able to beat. With the record they do a little bit easier, overtime wins against both Montreal and Minnesota, but they still get the 2 points in the standings in each of those games, and then finish their week with a very impressive 2-0 shutout of one of the hottest teams in the NHL in the Winnipeg Jets, also last week's number 1 team on this list. Now, obviously, the big news with the Flyers over the last week was the trade to get Drysdale from the Ducks, or I guess more to get Cutter Gauthier away from the Flyers. Either way, Drysdale in the 2 games he's played with the Flyers before now being day-to-day with an injury did get 2 assists in those 2 games, so it's been a good start for him. And honestly, for the Flyers, it seemed like a pretty good return for a guy that didn't have any interest in actually signing or ever playing with the team. Moving on, though, into the top 10, we start with a team that probably would have been here if I had done a preseason rankings, but certainly have not earned a spot anywhere near the top 10 until just recently. That being the Edmonton Oilers, who, speaking of hot streaks, are on the NHL's longest winning streak of 10 games in a row. And a large part of the reason for this turnaround of the Oilers, just like with the Kraken, is their ability to keep the puck out of their own net, as they've finally figured out how to get somebody to save a goal or 2. And now over these last 8 games on this winning streak, just like the Kraken had there for a while, they too have gone 8 straight games without giving up more than 2 goals. Which, considering how things were going for the first couple months of the season, seems like a minor miracle. Now, yes, even with that being said about their sudden ability to keep the puck out of their net, they still have been tempting fate over these last 4 games against not particularly great opponents. A 3-1 win over Ottawa, a 2-1 win over a Bedardless Blackhawks team, and then a couple of overtime wins to close out this last week. One against Detroit, who actually is a good opponent, but then another overtime win against Montreal, who, I mean, still right around 500, but under 500 and towards the bottom of the Eastern Conference. But at least for me anyway, they still are getting these wins 10 in a row. Even if they are close, it's still 2 points in the standings either way. And if I was an Oilers fan, I'd probably be happy with it being close in this way rather than just barn burners of games. Because you're finally getting that great goaltending, and you know that the scoring is going to come, even if they're going through a bit of a drier spell here. So to still be getting wins, thanks to goaltending, yeah, I think that's something Oilers fans would happily take, especially considering this team is analytically one of the best teams in the NHL at 5-on-5. They're easily the best team offensively at 5-on-5. I mean, while there are plenty of teams that are scoring 3 or more goals per game, the Oilers actually somewhere around 3.5, easily inside the top 10. They are the only team in the NHL that is getting 3 or more expected goals at 5-on-5 per game. The only team that's close to 3 other than them is surprisingly the Pittsburgh Penguins. So again, just another sign that this last stretch is probably a dry spell for them offensively, and over the rest of the season, they probably will start scoring more than they have in these last few games, even though they're still getting the wins. And you probably didn't need me to tell you that, considering the offensive firepower they have, especially on those top 2 lines. So once again, welcome to the top 10 for the first time, Edmonton Oilers, and they definitely could be moving up this list by this time next week, especially considering the team right above them is their next opponent in the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now for the Maple Leafs, it was not a good finish to the week, as they did start off with a win and a big one against the Sharks, although they probably should be beating the Sharks. Still 7-1 is a pretty good score. But then they lost their next 3 straight and blew leads in all 3 of those games, starting with a loss in overtime on the island, and then back-to-back blown leads at home against Detroit and Colorado. And the obvious big difference for the Leafs in the last 3 losses here versus the 4-game win streak that they had coming into that is the goals against, where in that 4-game winning streak, they'd given up just 3 goals in those 4 games, with a shutout against LA, which looks good, although LA is fallen off of the map. 8 straight losses for the Kings, falling all the way out of this top 10, and then gave up just 1 goal in the next 3 games. Though that was to the Ducks, and then back-to-back games against the Sharks. So then as their opponents got harder, they started letting in goals with 4, 5, and 4 goals against in their next 3 games. And I certainly don't think that that's all on Martin Jones either, especially considering Samsonov did play the last of those losses against the Red Wings, but even at that, it's really not necessarily goaltending that's the big story all of a sudden. It's more team defense, as the way that they're playing in front of this goaltending is really to blame for what's happening and how they're giving up these leads late in games. And if it turns out that it is the quality of opponent that's giving the Leafs trouble, going from those 3 games against the Ducks and then 2 against the Sharks, to then Islanders, Avalanche, and Red Wings, well, it's bad news for Leafs fans, as 5 of their next 6 games come against some of the hottest teams in the NHL. As up next, they take their yearly trip to Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest, starting in Edmonton against the Oilers and that 10-game winning streak. Then they get the Flames, who's probably their easiest opponent in these next 6 games. Then it's on to Vancouver, who, based on how they're playing, might be on a 7-game winning streak by the time they get there. Then Seattle, another team on a 9-game winning streak, and who knows what it'll look like by the time that game rolls around. Then back-to-back games against the Jets. So, yeah, for the Maple Leafs, they've got to get something figured out, or they could really start to slip in the standings and obviously find their way out of this top 10. Meanwhile, up next in the 8th spot, I have a team headed in the opposite direction and back into the top 10. It's the Dallas Stars. For the Stars, they do win 3 of their 4 games this week, even if it is 2 against a reeling Wild team and then the Blackhawks. But again, you can only play who you're given, and it's still 6 points in the standings that they probably should have gotten based on how their opponents were playing coming into those games. And it certainly helps, or should help, the Stars here going into the future that they also got Ottinger back this week. And yeah, he did get a bit rocked in his first game back against the Predators, who, for Nashville, the last 2 losses for the Stars are against the Predators. And if they keep playing the way they are, they'll find their way at least into the honorable mentions here in the near future. But for the Stars, they do bounce back, get that win with just 1 goal allowed for Ottinger in the game against the Blackhawks, and hopefully that is a good sign for him as he gets back into the NHL coming off of that injury. Plus, it will help that they don't have to run Wedgwood out there every game like they did for quite a stretch. Although I suppose for what it's worth, the 1 game that Matt Murray played in net for them, he did get a shutout against the Wild, so maybe it wouldn't have been the worst thing if they gave Ottinger a little bit more time, but either way, I think the Stars are very happy to have their starting goaltender back. Meanwhile, at the other end of the ice, they are scoring plenty of goals, now 3rd in the NHL in goals for per game, and have scored at least 3 goals in their last 9 games. So if Ottinger can get back to form as he gets the rust knocked off back at the NHL level, then this is a Stars team that should definitely get back on a run and work their way back into that conversation with the Avalanche and Jets for the lead of the Central Division. Of course, that being said, they will need the Avalanche and Jets to slow down a little bit, but either way, they'll certainly solidify themselves as that 3rd team, if not working their way back up to the other 2. Moving on to the 7th spot, I have the Carolina Hurricanes, who really don't move a ton, largely because they were one of the least busy teams in the NHL this weekend, easily the least busy on this list, having played just the 2 games. And they do come out with 2 wins in those games, a decisive win over the Ducks, as it should be considering how they're playing, and then an overtime win against the Penguins, who have been playing pretty well, so that's still a good win and 2 points more in the standings. Plus, for the Canes, they just keep chugging along in this upward trajectory, now 7-0-1 in their last 8 games. So we'll see if that continues over the next week. I don't have a ton more to say about them, obviously having played pretty well, giving up just the 4 goals in 2 games. Sorry, quick correction, 5 goals against in the last 2 games. Either way, better than what they were getting when things weren't going well for them, so Ronta's playing pretty well in net. And again, 9 goals the other way, so plenty to get those 4 points. And on top of all of it for the Canes, if they keep playing the way that they have been here over this last stretch, they might just end up leading their division before too much longer, especially considering right above them in their division and here in the power rankings, in the 6th spot, it's the New York Rangers. And oh, how the mighty have fallen for the Rangers. A tough couple of weeks. See them go from reigning atop these power rankings for over a month to now here down in the bottom 5. And part of that is because a couple of teams got hot here over this last week and just jumped them. But it has been a tough couple of weeks. They had 4 losses in a row that started with a couple of games that saw 11 goals go against, both with Shesterkin in net, and not all those were against Shesterkin. He does give up 9 with a couple of empty netters. So yeah, a couple of tough games there. Fortunately, they do bounce back from that with just 5 goals against in the next 2. Obviously, that back-to-back against DC, so Shesterkin in net for the second one, Quick in net for the first. But the big problem, really, for the Rangers has been that the offense has dried up entirely, as they scored just 9 goals in the last 4 games. 3, 2, 2, and 2, so consistently not a lot of goals. It's not like they had 8 goals in one game, 1 and a couple shutouts or anything like that. They just consistently are not finding the back of the net, which was a concern considering offensively, this is a team that was kind of being carried by their power play. And now that that's not happening, yeah, it's tough sledding. Now, obviously for the Rangers, the good news is that they did build themselves a significant buffer with those fantastic months of November and December, so they could afford to go on a bit of a skid here to start the new year. Plus, after a game coming up here against a Kraken team that's red hot, but will be coming on the back half of a back-to-back, they then go on a stretch on a road trip against teams that have been certainly struggling of late or just over the entire season, as they'll get Vegas and LA, both have kind of been on skids of their own, then Anaheim and San Jose before they get Vegas back in New York. So it certainly is a stretch of games coming up here for them that does offer the opportunity to get things turned around and back to how they were going here over the last couple of months that earned them that spot at the top of this list for as long as they were there. For now, though, they've definitely started to slip, and it had to show in these rankings. Now, as for the teams that jumped the Rangers, I will admit that the first one here that jumped them in the last week in the Boston Bruins did not necessarily have a convincing week of their own, as they too only came up with 1 win on the week. But with that being said, they were already kind of close to the Rangers for me in the rankings last week, and they did lose all 3 of those games that they lost in overtime, so at the very least they picked up 3 points and kept those games close. And it has been that important ability of the Bruins to stay in games, especially with the loser point being a thing in the NHL, that has separated them now from the Rangers, especially considering even with 4 losses in their last 10 games, they have gotten points in 9 of those 10 with those 3 overtime losses, which does now make them the top team in the East in the standings with those 59 points in their 43 games. Still not the highest rated team on this list, but it is a Bruins team that, thanks to overtime losses, even if they don't have the most wins in the East, do have the most points. Of course, with that being said, they too, like the Rangers, have kind of now over the last stretch here been riding the hot start to the season that they had, and been a little bit more mediocre of late, which has also shown up in the advanced stats where, when it comes to expected goals for and against, also like the Rangers, they are almost smack dab NHL average in both, just slightly better defensively than the Rangers have been. And just for one more similarity between they and the Rangers, they too, with this newfound mediocrity, have allowed another team in their division who is now red hot to catch up to them and potentially challenge for that division lead. A team that we'll be getting to here just in a second, but not before we get to, in 4th place, the Colorado Avalanche. Now for the Avalanche, they might not have had some big fancy winning streak like a few of the teams in the NHL have here of late, including one in their division, but make no mistake, this is still one of the hottest teams in the league. 8-1-1 now in their last 10, and having won all 3 of their games this week. 4-3 over Boston in overtime, because Boston always goes to overtime this week, but then a shutout over Vegas, 3-0, and then that comeback win against Toronto, 5-2. And that ability to score goals has been a consistent here over this last stretch, as they've scored 3 or more goals in 9 of their last 10 games. Which, yes, does include the one they gave up 8 to Florida, but still, they have had no trouble scoring goals, and more often than not, significantly so, been able to keep enough pucks out of their own net to come away with the 2 points in the standings. And it is a good thing too that they've been scoring as much as they have, second in the NHL to Vancouver in goals for per game, because the goaltending has been a bit hit or miss here. I mean, never really bad other than that one game against Florida, but Georgiev certainly hasn't been the best in the NHL or anywhere near the best in the NHL that he was through the early part of the season. Now, with that being said, it certainly is possible, and maybe this fact makes it even more impressive that Georgiev has still been above NHL average over this time, that he has played every game for the Avalanche over the last month, which does kind of raise some questions over how sustainable that is, but it seems to be working for them, so who am I to argue? I'd still suggest that maybe it would be good to get him a couple of games off here and there if this is the guy you want to ride into the playoffs and not play him for the entire rest of the season. I mean, I'm sure there's some back-to-backs coming up that he would probably sit for at least one of those 2 games. Either way, they're seeming to win with him in net regardless of whether or not he has a night off here and there. An offensive attack for the Avalanche that is obviously led by Nathan MacKinnon and his second best in the NHL, 69 points, which is a pretty nice start to his season, or half of his season. And I suppose one more time with Georgiev, depending on how you want to look at it, maybe he did just decide to take the night off anyway in that game against the Panthers, which I only really bring up as a way to segue into our team in third place, which is those Florida Panthers. The Florida Panthers, who just had a 9-game winning streak, snapped here at the end of the week. But regardless, this is absolutely, again, another one of the NHL's hottest teams, and certainly the hottest team in their division and Eastern Conference as a whole. For the Panthers, though, it still has been an impressive streak here over these last few weeks, those 9 straight games, even if it does get snapped with a 4-1 loss to the Devils at home here to finish off this week, but they still started out with a 5-1 win over a Blues team that's been surprisingly pretty good, and then a win over the Kings as well, even if that took overtime, and yeah, it's a Kings team that's kind of reeling in their own right. But the Panthers picking up points pretty much in every game they've played now for quite some stretch, which has now caught them up to the Bruins, and they actually have 2 more wins than the Bruins do in the same number of games. Just a lot fewer loser points, which now has the Bruins still ahead of them by 3 points. Even still, though, in spite of what the standings might say, this team, at least to me, is definitely playing the best hockey of any team in the Eastern Conference, and certainly the best in their division. And it's not just that they're scoring a lot of goals or not giving very many up, other than, again, giving 4 up and scoring just 1 in this game against the Devils, but it's also that they're playing a style of hockey that we know is incredibly successful in the playoffs in particular. This is a team that will beat the crap out of you and certainly skirt the line of the rules, even probably going over it and just not getting the calls, pretty much every night. Now, whether or not that's sustainable over the course of the entire back half of the season going into the playoffs, or if they'll start to pay the price a bit with bumps and bruises and injuries here and there, will remain to be seen, but at least right now, they are playing exactly the way that you would like to see a team play if you want to have that postseason success, and maybe if you're a Panthers fan, have a similar run just with 3 more wins than they saw last year. And of course, even on top of all that, even more good news for the Panthers, since we did talk about it quite frequently when things weren't going well for him, Matthew Tkachuk has come alive here in this last stretch as well, going from 5 goals on the season, which he was stuck on for quite a while, to now 12, with 7, over doubling his total in just these last few games. And if Tkachuk does get hot here over the back half of the season and play like the Tkachuk we saw in Florida last year, and the team continues to play the way they have been over this last stretch, this is a team that could very easily find their way leading not only their division, the Eastern Conference, but maybe even end up with a second President's Trophy in 3 years. Though, based on how the President's Trophy is received, maybe the fans wouldn't want that, but yeah, I think it's a good sign when you win a lot of games as you go into the playoffs. Even if, again, it didn't work great for the Bruins last year. Of course, though, even if they did want to make that run for the President's Trophy, they'd still have to go through, well, still the Bruins and Rangers technically in the East, but also the 2 teams ahead of them in this power rankings in the West, starting with, in second place, the Winnipeg Jets, which does mean that you now know who's in first, But for the Jets, they dropped to second because their winning streak does come to an end. Still, their week started out great with a 5-0 win over the Blue Jackets, but they kind of used up all their goal scoring in that game, as they still win the second one 2-1 over Chicago, but then get shut out 2-0 against the Flyers, which, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the fans are still excited about the fact that even with a loss that didn't have much exciting happen for them, considering they get shut out, they still get to maintain that streak of giving up 3 or less goals in now 32 straight games, as they continue to march towards what could be an NHL record streak as far as not giving up goals is concerned. But it does snap that winning streak, as they are now 8-1-1 in their own right in their last 10. Still, this is absolutely one of the best teams in the NHL, and even if the goal scoring did dry up over these last 2 games, it'll probably still come back to some extent. Whether or not it'll come back to the extent it was at for a while there, at least until Kyle Connor comes back, we'll have to wait and see. But this is a Jets team that, it has to be said, has also been battling through injuries even outside of Connor, with Scheifele missing a game or 2, but at least he's day-to-day, and Gustafsson should be back soon, so that maybe helps this team get back to where they were going with that 8-game winning streak, their franchise record 8-game winning streak. And actually, for what it's worth, I forgot to mention that Edmonton's 10-game winning streak is also a franchise record, and Seattle's 9-game winning streak a franchise record for them. So franchise records being set all over the place with winning streaks for teams. But again, for the Jets, as long as Hellebuck and Brossoit in the games that he plays aren't giving up more than 2 or 3 goals a game, they really don't need the offense to rebound that much in order to get back to winning the vast majority of their games and continuing to run away with this Central Division. And for what it's worth, still by points percentage, they do have the lead in the NHL, but they don't have the lead in these power rankings, and if they want to run away with the Western Conference and get that first seed, they're still going to have to keep in front of the team that I have in first, in the Vancouver Canucks. Now, the Canucks do basically jump into this first spot because the Jets lost that one game at the end of the week, and the Canucks did not lose this week, as they end up going in and demolishing the 2 teams in New York, 6-3 over the Rangers, then 5-2 over the Islanders, and a couple of less convincing wins to finish off the week, as they have an overtime win against Pittsburgh, who has been playing pretty well of late, so that's still a pretty good win. And then they win 1-0 over the Sabres, which, I mean, shutouts are always fun, but to score just 1 against the Sabres, I mean, it's still 2 points in the standings. Plus, for the Canucks, they do now have 5 wins in a row, which it's not 8 or 9 or 10 wins like some other teams, but it still is a pretty good run, and sure, their 7-2-1 in their last 10 is the worst of the top 3 teams on this list, but this is a Canucks team that continues to score goals at a ridiculous rate, aside from the one game in Buffalo, with their plus 55 goal differential being easily the best in the NHL. It's actually over double third place at 27. The only team between them is actually the Winnipeg Jets at plus 42. But for the Canucks, regardless of what any advanced stats say, and they still point to this team being pretty much NHL average when it comes to 5-on-5 offense, they continue to defy all of that. And although those stats have been getting better, they continue to play even better than that improvement. And for the Canucks, regardless of how it's happening, this winning streak and continued great play by the team couldn't be coming at a better time, as the 2 teams below them in the Pacific Division that were keeping pace have now started to fall off, and fall off pretty quickly in Vegas and LA. Now, obviously, Seattle and Edmonton are catching Vancouver at least a little bit, but they're so far behind that I really don't think it's anything to worry about for Vancouver, who, at least right now, looks like they're going to run away with that first place in the Pacific Division, and who knows, maybe even the Western Conference. Still, the race between they and Winnipeg will be pretty interesting to watch, but it seems like those are the 2 teams that are likely to face the wild card matchups in the first round of the playoffs and host those series. And just real quick, I probably would take the goaltender of the Jets between the 2 as far as the leader in the Vezina right now in Hellebuck, but Demko has obviously continued to be fantastic, and it is basically a 2-horse race for me between those 2 at this point in the season, and I don't think that's a stretch to say. And you know what? Even if I'm not a big fan of it, being that I'm a fan of Seattle, I have to admit that it is a well-earned first place here for the Canucks, what with Pettersson trying to win the Hart, Demko trying to win the Vezina, Hughes trying to win the Norris. It's really no wonder that Vancouver did eventually find their way to the top of these rankings. Whether or not they're here this time next week, we'll have to wait and see, as this is now the 3rd week in a row with a new team on top of these rankings. But at least for now, they are my best team in the NHL, though it's close between they and the Jets, so the 2 of those could flip-flop again here in a week's time. But until then, Let me know what you think down in the comment section below, who your top 10 teams would be, what you think I got wrong, what teams were too high, what teams were too low, what I might have missed in talking about each of the teams, as I'm to obviously have to leave a lot of things out or this video would be an hour long. And as always, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, which if you made it to this point, I imagine you did, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, like and subscribe, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next week, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken! Finally on the top 10, and legitimately so. Well, actually not on the top 10, they're an honorable mention, but hey, keep this winning streak going, they'll be up there just like the Oilers.